Hello from Denver, Colorado. I want to thank the Dalí Museum for inviting me to come give some reflections on the exhibit today. And I want to thank Mr. Canosa especially for giving us such a suggestive collection of work. And today, really, I could talk about so many things in the exhibit. There's so much to say, but I just want to share some reflections um, on the nature of line. And the first types of lines, or one of the things that I think line does in the exhibit, is pareidolia. So pareidolia is originally it was used by psychologists to describe the experience of seeing images in things that aren't really there, which is to say, kind of meaningful images in what is otherwise not meaningful data. So originally, in the 19th century, it was thought of as sort of like a kind of pathology to see these images. Now we know that pareidolia, lots of people see pareidolia, and there are some famous examples. One of those is this one here. This is a rock from Mars that looks like a face, and it's hard not to see the face there. Um, Pareidolia is, in Mr. Canosa's words about surrealism, it's a way of looking at and relating to experience. And one of the things that I find interesting about the works that Mr. Canosa has collected here is that they all sort of elicit this kind of pareidolia. One of the things that I think is interesting about what Canosa has done is that he's sort of gone back to Dalí's home and his natural landscapes and just surrounded himself there. I mean, these are the landscapes of trees, of caves, of island coastlines that were suggestive to Dalí and suggestive to Canosa. Again, this is working at what this French philosopher of art, Gaston Bachelard, calls the material unconscious. That is, we often think about the unconscious as just within inside of our head. But the unconscious is not just something inside of us. The unconscious is things we're not aware of that are in the environment that shape the way that we think. And for Dalí, that was the place that he lived, you know, that was the Bay Area, that was the islands, that was the caves, the trees, the beaches. Those are things that, you know, suggested to Dalí a certain, you know, most likely lots of pareidolia. But this is what I think that kind of it's an interesting connection. The same material surroundings, or very nearly the same ones that affected Dalí, now affect Canosa, suggest to him works of art that respond to that, and then share it with us, the viewers, that can go through the exhibit and have in an interesting kind of creatively mediated way, sort of access to some of those initial insights and patterns that Dalí himself was seeing. And so there's a couple ways that this is done. I mentioned so these lines, the patterns and images from the beach, from the mountains, from the coastline and shape of coastlines that are in some of the works that Canosa has presented, the horizon line, that shape and outline of the horizon, the trees, rocks. So all of these patterns, they tend, these are very specific types of patterns that tend to be very, what I'm saying, suggestive, which is to say they tend to elicit pareidolia. Another word to describe some of these patterns are fractal. Fractal patterns are these kinds of jagged patterns that are suggestive of pareidolia. And I'll say more in just a second. But just a note quickly about Dalí's own experience and use of pareidolia. Dalí would certainly, in so many of these double images or even triple images, Dalí he's very explicit about them. They, you know, they're not exactly like coastlines or horizon lines or trees, but he would use images to suggest other images. And he would bring them out very sort of, you know, directly or representationally. In both of these images, you can see sort of both at once. And he's very explicitly trying to get you to see something that's not there. And that's his sort of method of doing things. I think what I found in some of Canosa's works is very similar, a sort of range of images that elicit this pareidolia. Here's one. I'm not entirely sure because I've not been to the exhibit, unfortunately, but This one, I'm not sure it's like melted glass or maybe plastic. To me, I'll say a bit more, but to me, they seem kind of like melted lead from bullets. But in any case, these patterns to me were very pareidolic, I guess. But they suggest this kind of skull shape. Here, another one of Canosa's images. This is very similar to what the psychologist Rorschach, he would put these ink blots, fold them up, and produce a kind of symmetric splatter of random ink, ask patients what they saw, and then use that as a method of kind of accessing the unconscious, of getting them to reveal something of what they were feeling or thinking in the images themselves. So these are classic images that were historically and are well known to produce pareidolia. Here's another one that I find more Dalí-esque, which is just a kind of direct representational thing, the canoe as human body, and a kind of overlaying or double image that's more representational. Whereas this one above that the canoe sort of it's less representational. Although it's very suggestive of all kinds of things, maybe birds and trees. Okay, so what exactly is these fractal patterns? So there's a bunch of social science psychology studies that show that some images tend to elicit more pareidolia than others, and that's what I'm saying is happening in all of these tree line and these images that both Dalí and more so even actually Canosa is giving us more fractal patterns than Dalí is. So here in this image, you can see Canosa has presented there's like that mountain horizon line, that jagged line is fractal. The paintings there are also fractal. And this one, I really like this one a lot because one of the classic fractal images, which I'll define in just a second exactly what a fractal is, but one feature of fractals is they tend to be sort of iterative or branching. And the classic fractal pattern is trees. Because trees, you have this branching pattern. You have the same kind of pattern iterated again and again and again at smaller scales. So every tiny little twig, even every capillary in a leaf, has this branching pattern that looks like the branching pattern on the twigs, which looks like it on the branches, which looks like it on the larger branches. So you across scales, you have the same pattern iterated. But what I like about this one is not just the fractal branch of the tree itself, but also there's a kind of, if we could see inside of this woman's body, we would see that the inside of the human body has these same branching pathways that actually look like an upside down tree. If you could see all the nerve endings and vessels and capillaries inside the human body, it has the same kind of fractal structure as the tree branch does. And this is, to me, very suggestive of this kind of internal, external. It's not just the juxtaposition of a tree branch and a woman, but also there's something visible and invisible about those fractal patterns. Okay, so one famous artist that uses these fractal patterns is Jackson Pollock. And there's a physicist, Richard Taylor at the University of Oregon, who's spent a lot of time analyzing the fractal dimensions of Jackson Pollock's paintings. So maybe you could just take a second, don't look at the bottom for the spoilers, but you could take a second and look at these images that I've put up here and try to figure out which one is a Jackson Pollock painting. I will tell you, well, you could take a second. Okay, now I will tell you that each of the what each of these are in a sort of in clockwise pattern, starting with the upper left. This is a bush. There's some vegetation. Then there's seaweed. Bottom right is trees. Bottom left is spider webs. And right there in the middle left is the Jackson Pollock painting. You can see that this is a very different way of using fractals and even of producing pareidolia. You'd have to get up closer to these images to start to see more of the pareidolia going on inside of them. But in Dalí and surrealism, the pareidolia is, as again, more representational. Here, this is non-representational kinds of pareidolia. Now, one way to think about what fractals are or what they do is that they are a fraction of a dimension between first dimension, in this case, between first dimension and second dimension. There is fractions of a dimension. That sounds very abstract, but it's actually extremely concrete. It's maybe one of the most concrete things. What's truly abstract is here, the one dimension, the line, and the two dimension square. Those are abstract. We hardly ever see those kinds of things in nature. we see a lot of things in between: seaweed, trees, clouds. All of these things are fractional. And I'll give you some more images in just a second. But if you think about a fractal, there's a range between 1 and 2. And so you could have 1.1, 1.2, 1.3, 1.4. Increasingly, as a line transforms, if you could watch a line metamorphose into a square, it would go through this whole range of fractal dimensions. That's one way to think about what a fractal is. Here, you can see this is what's going on in these 4 images. What's happening is the image on the left is becoming increasingly closer to 2. So 1.1 and 1.0 and 2.0. This is the first dimension, second dimension, and you can see that as the images becomes more fragmented or broken down. Now, if you look at these images, I personally see there's a face in these images. To me, the pareidolia, or the suggestive face inside of these images, is most clearly visible to me in those middle 2 images. So as things approach 1 dimension, they become less suggestive, and as they become close to the second dimension, they also become less suggestive. Right in the middle is kind of a sweet spot where fractals become very suggestive and produce more pareidolia. And I'm not just making this up. This is what the studies show. Here's another example. Which one of these images, top or bottom, do you think produces more pareidolia? More people see more images in which image? The top image. The top image has more fractal dimension than the bottom one, which is very low. It would be closer to 1. That top one would be closer to the middle. So this is like a very simple kind of Rorschach image meant to suggest pareidolia, and indeed it does. Okay, so what does all this have to do with surrealism and contemporary art? Well, I mean, these are techniques. This technique of both producing pareidolia and generating fractal patterns is throughout both contemporary art, and surrealism is very much at some of the very explicit beginnings of playing with that, knowing how to elicit unconscious images that you didn't maybe want to see or even try to see, but you kind of just saw them. They were already there and very difficult to unsee once you've seen them, but very easy to see once somebody points it out to you. So in the surrealist pareidolia, here's another Dalí image. Again, he uses representational figures, these women here in the doorway, to produce another representational image of the face. And then in Pollock, we have a very non-representational kind of pareidolia. So this is all way of saying that one thing that Canosa's collection is doing is kind of playing across a range of abstract and representational forms of pareidolia. So here on the right is one image of this is waterfalls and caves. But you also have the figure, the kind of, representational figure, but you also have lots of fractal dimensions here. You have very suggestive lines that are very fractal. And the bottom left one, I wish I could get a closer look at this, but you can in the gallery. This one suggests to me, even though this image here I know is not very good, this is a very non-representational kind of image. That probably has some mid-range fractal dimension to it, but could suggest all kinds of patterns and forms that might come out of it. Whereas on the right, you have an image that's more somewhere between, if you will, abstract and more representational. So one more thing to say about the kind of fluidity of line. Line is interesting because line, I mean, in its abstract kind of geometrical Euclidean sense, line doesn't really have, if we narrowed it down to a perfectly one-dimensional abstraction, it doesn't really have any form. But if you fold up that line, if you begin to twist the line and shape the line or iterate the line, you can start to see the emergence of form out of something that is itself formless, namely line, the mutational character of line to generate form out of formlessness. I mentioned lines before. Here in the image above, we can see both the lines of the woman and the branch there, but on the left-hand side of the image above, a series of lines sort of produce that kind of jagged outline that is very close to something like you would see in a tree line on a horizon or a mountain line on the horizon, which that line itself, its jagged character, has a fractal dimension. It's a classical that Mandelbrot talked about in his book on the fractal geometry of nature. It's called Brownian, but we don't need to get in the details. But the point is that the line itself, its jaggedness is fractal, and it's both pleasing. People find it aesthetically pleasing in the social psychology studies about fractals. That if you show them some horizon lines, don't tell them it's horizon line. They'll just compare that to another smoother line, and they will find the typically the more fractal horizon line more pleasing. So some of these lines present at Dalí's home and brought to us by Canosa are the tree line, the coastline, at the Port Legat, the mountain line, the Tramontana, that sort of the wind that sort of comes through the mountains. I mean, part of the wind coming through the mountains is that mountain line itself, and the mountains themselves, which are deeply fractal, very suggestive. Mountains, rocks, mountain lines. It's said that Dalí was touched by the mountain wind, as sort of a euphemism for his madness. That there's something, some kind of madness or something that Dalí sees in the world that everyone doesn't. Now, I mean, it's a good question of why do some people see more pareidolia than others? It's true. Some people very easily see pareidolia. Other people, it's much harder for them to see pareidolia. Why some people and not others? We don't know, but some of the social psychology studies show that artists tend to see more pareidolia, not surprisingly, than not artists. People who are more creative tend to find those. So there's this connection that I think brings us, that Canosa lets us come back to some of Dalí's initial kind of atmospheric, ecological, environmental conditions that suggested to him all kinds of patterns. Fractal lines produce pareidolia. And pareidolia is, not everybody sees the same thing. And that's partly what's interesting to it is, I think Dalí, had he known this word, perhaps he did, he loved that. He wanted those to come out. And I think Canosa's work really plays with that. But of course, in a range, some more representational, some less representational. So the other type of line that I wanted to talk about that appears in Canosa's exhibit are border lines. So some of the works have a more, to me at least, seem a more political. Lines are interesting, not just because they can generate these fractal forms that produce creativity, pareidolia, that unleash a kind of material unconscious that plays with us directly. It's not always about representing something, but about engaging the viewer. Lines can also, though, divide. They can break things apart. So lines can do different things. They can connect, like the lines that connect many of the works in the exhibit, but they can also, break things apart and separate them. And some of the works really get at that. They can dissolve form, they can produce form. There are straight lines, which are definitely not fractal. So some of the straight lines are very interesting here. And these two works in these images suggest to me that dividing capacity of the line to sort of break down and divide things and separate them apart. One, you have, compared to the sort of jagged, broken, iterative character of difference and repetition in so many of the other images, and including the globe, itself, the distribution, that shape of, this is one of the classical fractal patterns that Mandelbrot analyzed, was the fractal geometry of the coastline of England. If you or Great Britain, as you get closer and closer, you can see that it gets just more jagged and more jagged all the way down. If you try to measure the coastline of Great Britain, but it's the same with pretty much all islands and continents. There's this jagged, iterative, fragmented kind of fractal pattern, versus here, the gunman just is an identical repetition, a feature of modernist art, repetition, but it has a very different character here. The gunman is this kind of exact or nearly exact repetition, coupled with this very straight line. And of course, the straight line right across what appears to me to be the US-Mexico border, dividing the global north and south, raising questions about warfare, neoliberalism, border politics, of course, with the gunman. And then on the left, the image of what, again, to me, sort of next to this image, makes me think about like a wound, um, uh, like sutures and stitches being closing up a wound. Um, Next to this image of the U.S.-Mexico border and the gunman, to me reminds me of a quote from one of my favorite border theorists, Gloria Anzaldúa. She writes that the U.S.-Mexican border es una herida abierta. It's an open wound where the third world grates against the first and bleeds. And before a scab forms, it hemorrhages again. The lifeblood of two worlds merging to form a third country, a border country. So one way to think about lines too is not just about what they divide, left, right, up, down, north, south, but also what the line itself is, what the border itself is. It is itself something. It's neither on either side. And that's one of the things that Anzaldúa writes a lot about, are border worlds that are in between worlds. They are neither, they're their own world, if you will, that the border creates its own kind of culture, its own kind of mixture of languages, of identities, of images. It creates its own kind of world. And so there's something in the line itself that becomes creative at the same time as being destructive. So again, back to some of these images, this one, again, I can't really tell what the materials are, but to me, it very much reminds me of melted bullets, perhaps in the context of the gunman. My imagination is connecting these things. But what's interesting too is that if that's the case, and I'm just going to go with it here, that something about the idea of the bullet, the melted splattered lead of bullets, it melts down, right? The straight line of the bullet firing hits, melts down, and it produces these kind of metamorphic fractal forms that themselves produce pareidolia. Imagination can come out of these sites of destruction, the open wounds between the global north and south. It's not only a place of destruction, but it's also a site of creativity, of mixture. And again, sort of in this image here at the top right of the globe itself, sort of inverted, there's this other possible world, this other imaginary world without lines. There are not lines running through this one, global north and south. The possibility of a kind of fractal globe, of, if you will, one of imagination and pareidolia. And then in the bottom right, I like this image. I'm sorry the resolution is not as good. You can go look at it in the gallery. This to me has the same kind of, these outlines of fractal form, the way in which you can see in the globe above, the way that that fractal coastline of the continents looks. And you have images here that are more, creative. They're utilizing the same kind of fractal contrast of shapes, suggesting images, suggesting possible worlds, suggesting different realities. So yeah, these are some of the ways that I think line can play out, or does play out here in Canosa's work, that connects us back to Dalí, to the surrealist, but also still contemporary. Much of modern art still uses many of these fractal forms to suggest pareidolia, to bring us in. It's not about representing one thing or another, but about producing a world in which there are many possibilities that we come to see and use our imaginations, or they use us, however we want to think about that. Anyway, thank you for your time.